Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stefan Schlichting. We had some technical difficulties, so that why I will introduce myself on the next slide, and then we will directly start with the presentation. So today, I would like to present to you on the whole topic of devices on fire and how enabling health device data-driven applications can be solved with FHIR, maybe in combinations also with some other interoperability standards. The content for this presentation is not only based on my work, but also from a big working group. And I would like to name two other participants that contributed heavily to this. That is Katrin Riech from the University of Lübeck and Todd Cooper from Trusted Solutions Foundry, and who is also organizing a lot of the efforts around devices on fire. So to start, who is presenting today to you? As mentioned before, my name is Stefan Schlichting. I'm currently a manager for product and service innovation at Unity. We are a consulting company, and in my role, I focus on systems engineering and interoperability standards, especially for the medtech industry, but also for other industries that are maybe pharmaceutical or hospital related. I'm also one of the chairs or co-chairs either in IEEE 1173 working group, in the IHE devices domain, HL7 healthcare devices, and also member of a non-for-profit organization called or.net, which deals with a lot of the issues, problems, or solutions around how to get medical device data into data-driven applications. And this is also the starting point now from my side. We did mention in the title of this talk that we want to talk about health device data-driven applications. And what do we understand under this big umbrella? So on the first hand, we didn't say medical device data-driven applications, because we want to include here not only those that are maybe medical treatment related, but maybe also from the personal health space. And then we do have three big clusters here from the application perspective. One I would summarize as maybe data-driven clinical applications, where I would see something like real-time patient status views, maybe something like a remote supervisor support, maybe even remote control, or applications that support scenarios where an isolation room should be controlled from the outside. Then we would have the other big cluster of automated documentation. And this topic is maybe related to some kind of data analytics that you want to do on the documented data. Maybe you just want to have it for forensic purposes or reimbursement purposes, or you want to build some KPIs, for example, and track resource utilization, or you just want to know maybe where the device is, where it has been used, and where you can find it. And the third big cluster here would be related to the whole topic of care automation. So this could start from something like an automated planning or just a manual planning, and go over setup systems, for example, for operating rooms, maybe some recommender systems for device settings, but also maybe in the end physiological closed loop controller. And what we have seen in the last years, and that there is quite a hurdle for product and service innovation if we don't use interoperability standards for these kind of applications. And I'm very happy here that we now discuss more about the solution and not the problem. And I just want to give you in the next few minutes an insight about, okay, what kind of applications do we talk about that we can enable with devices on fire, as well as how does it really look like and feel when you work with these kind of resources. In the end, I want to give also an outlook on another presentation tomorrow from Katrin Riech and one of my colleagues, Tobias Wildi, who will do a Let's Build hand-on session on the whole topic of devices on fire. more to that on the end of the presentation. So let's start with one of the applications so that we just are sure of what kind of applications we're talking about. I think the most obvious one, or the currently maybe most discussed one, is how do we capture automatically device data inside of electronic medical records so that we can later retrieve them and do some kind of application on top of it. The second one that I would like to show you here is a little bit more application specific, and it is about how, for example, during pre-eclampsia setup, the patient, in this case, maybe the women, is actually cared for and monitored over the whole cycle, from being inside of the hospital, coming out of the hospital, and she still has the feeling that she is monitored and taken care of during this whole cycle. So this is not only an application that would be inside of the hospital, but also for, on the outside, on the ambulatory side, and maybe when she's at home. Another example that I would like to show here is one that I showed also in June, that was related, for example, to something like the COVID-19 pandemic, where you also want to have maybe that you can start monitoring patients when they are not already inside of the hospital, but maybe beforehand. And maybe, for example, you want to capture with some personal health devices, maybe the saturation of the blood level or the heart rate, and later on during the treatment you want to take that data into the hospital, maybe when the condition worsens, and there you connected the patient maybe to the patient monitoring system and treat him there. And maybe you cannot go into the room, or you want to have some supervisory support, so you maybe not only look at the devices that are directly at the bedside, but maybe also on some kind of mobile device as depicted here on the top. I have another use case that I would like to share with you, what's related to devices on fire. This is, for example, if you have a mass casualty incident or some kind of disaster where you in the future maybe want to have some kind of autonomous system that supports the patient therapy, where we do exchange data and maybe also have to exchange the data with some kind of remote monitoring system, so that maybe physicians can support the forces in the disaster side, so and help them understanding the patient's situation and monitor the autonomous patient therapy. This is also something that you could envision, maybe not tomorrow, but in the future. And one not so clinical setup, but I think also relevant for the whole topic of devices on fire, is how do we enable, for example, the monitoring of the equipment, the medical equipment inside of the hospital. How can we use the data that the device produce themselves, maybe for some kind of predictive maintenance with respect to the devices, and how is it maybe possible that we can actually know where the devices are during their life cycle, and maybe also determine the utilization of these devices for different treatments or other clinical processes. So I think that showed that we have a quite broad range of what we actually need to address when we talk about devices on fire and health data-driven applications in this field. And this is also what you will see now, is why the devices are represented in resources as they are currently in the fire world. I would like to start now with a little bit of a differentiation because we need it for later on in the discussion. We also saw already in the patient journey of the preeclampsia that there might be two different devices used, which have some kind of the same purpose because they monitor the patient. So for example, here on the right-hand side, we might have something like a personal health device, which might be a pulse oximeter connected to the finger here. And maybe when the patient is admitted to the hospital, she might be monitored with a point of care device like a multi-parameter patient monitor, which of course also does measure pulse oximeter. Why do we differentiate this? This is really dependent, or this is reflecting the complexity of the devices, and later on how they are actually modeled or represented in a FHIR resource way. So if we look at it from the interoperability standards landscape, then we do have really two sides there as well. So on the one hand side, in this case on the right hand side, the green here is the devices itself that are related to personal health and maybe directly interacted with by the patient and worn also during their daily life. They communicate, or there's a standard for it that's called ISO IEEE 11073 personal health device standards. And in these kind of architecture, there's typically also a FHIR personal health gateway, which might represent the data in the FHIR world and make them available maybe for hospital IT applications, but of course also for other IT applications that are not directly at the device side. On the left-hand side, inside of the hospital, or when we look at the point of care devices, we do have here the green circle, for example, for infusion pumps, patient monitors, ventilators. They use, or they are maybe about to use, the ISO IEEE 1173 standards family called SDC, Service-Oriented Device Connectivity. And it has a very similar setup. Typically, there will be some kind of a gateway in place to represent these device information, device data in the enterprise hospital IT world. So, and what we now have to address is that these two or these three circles, so here are more the device-related standards from 1173, and we have in the middle the more enterprise-focused standard, for example, HL7 FHIR. These are not competing standards, but they are more complementing each other. So here it's more about maybe some kind of a real-time applications where you maybe also want to execute control. And here is everything else where you might want to just do data analytics, maybe also some clinical decision support on some captured data there as well. If we look at this now from a data modeling perspective, what will be the effect? So I tried to depict here on the left-hand side the pulse oximeter. If we would look at the data model or the information model, how this would be represented in the personal health device domain from 1173, then we would have at the top something that's the medical device system, which would maybe identify this as a patient monitor with the type of pulse oximeter, and it has three so-called metrics, so measurements here, which might have a type of pulse, maybe the plethysmograph, and the saturation, and they of course have something like a unit. If we now look at more or less the other device from that would also monitor the patient and maybe also the pulse oximeter, like a multi-parameter patient monitor, you see here that there is on top again the medical device system, representing it in this case as a multi-parameter patient monitor, not a pulse oximeter. And there might be other measurement modules here on the level of the so-called virtual medical devices, VMD. So for example, we could have something like a non-invasive blood pressure, ECG or temperature module, and of course also a pulse oximeter module. Below that, inside of the point of care device world, we would have something called a channel, and we could have multiple channels in parallel here, for example, in the ECG world. And below the channel, we would have the metrics, and these are more or less the same as you can see them here. And now you also see the challenge. The complexity of these devices is quite different, even though they are kind of the same, that they monitor the patient. And this is also reflected in the how the FHIR device-related resources are built up. And that is something that I now would like to depict and explain. So if we look at the device-related resources, and this is really just a snapshot, there are way more, then we do have in the middle here the device resource itself. And I included, just for reference, this can be typed, so you can add a codable concept here to ensure that an instance, for example, would be reflected as a multi-parameter patient monitor. We do have from the device, we can reference a patient that is associated with this device, and we do have the measurements when they are executed, or maybe the settings instead of the observation resource. So, and from the observation, we would have a reference to the device that is has actually done this measurement. But then to reflect this structure of the point of care medical device that we have seen before with the medical device system, as well as the virtual medical device, which represents the module, and the channels below these measurement modules, the device structure itself has a recursive structure, so that you can have a parent from one device and can build this more or less tree, which is called in the medical device informatics, seeing the containment tree of the device. And then we do have something special here as well. That is the so-called device metric, which is basically a capability description of what kind of measurements this device can do. And from this metric, we can link up to the device inside of the tree. And we have a link as well here to the top level element of this recursive structure, so that we know from which real device system this device metric belongs to. And here you also see the details. So the observation could reference to the device, or alternatively, it could point to the device metric in the tree. From there on, you could go up to the device metric. And this is basically to capture the different complexities of the devices, as we just have seen them for the pulse oximeter from the personal health device world, as well as from the point of care device world. I mentioned already sometimes the word metric, which is the term that we use in the medical device informatics world to represent measurements, settings, calculations, recommendations, and so forth. And there are different kinds of these metrics. For example, we would have simple scalar values for numeric metrics, like the temperature, body temperature, blood oxygen level, maybe the heart rate. And when we would map them to the observation value, this would be typically represented as a value quantity. We might have something like a sequence of periodic scalars, for example, for ECG waveform traces. This would be somehow represented to value sample data. And we might have something more related to enumerations, where you have a finite set of options, for example, in settings. There you would represent it typically to the value codable concept. There's a small star up here, and we will see later why. These are actually profiled also for device-specific profiles. And this is something that I would like to start now with you. I would like to have a very short look on the personal health device implementation guide. And then I will do a bigger example or longer example from the point of care device world. So we have seen before this diagram here from the personal health devices where you have the pulse oximeter may be also used in daily use. This would be represented, as I mentioned before, in this kind of not so complex containment tree, having the medical device system at the top and the different metrics here below. And there the transformation is quite simple and straightforward. So we would have a device resource here, and we would have observations for the measurements when they are performed for the pulse, maybe the pulse and the saturation. So this is a quite straightforward mapping. If you want to know more about the PhD implementation guide, you can also find them here. I added the link, and you can find them in the documentation later. If we now look at the point of care device, there's also an implementation guide. And as you could envision, this is a little bit more complex because we have to reflect this structure, which it's in itself is more complex as the one that we have seen from the PhD world, and also the representation. This is also due to the fact that you typically want to maybe address other use cases from the scenarios that we have seen before. And I will walk you through an example use case on the next slide. But just to reflect the details here, so we do have the medical device system, which would be reflected as as a device resource, and it's actually later on profiled, as we see it here already with a medical device, MDS device. Then we would have another device which represents these modules here. So for the pulse oximeter module, there would be another device representing the pulse oximeter. Then we would have a channel which is represented with another device, and you can see here the trace up. And then we would have the device metrics here. They represent the capabilities that the device can measure pulse, pulse, and saturation. And what they also represent is actually the current status, if this is measured or not. And then, of course, we do have the observations below. So if a measurement occurred, we would have observation. And in this case, this would not reference the device, but the device metric. And from there on, you can go to the device or go through the parent to the channel device, the VMD device, and the MDS device. And why we want to do that, that I will explain with one example now. So I took the example that I had on one of my slides for maybe something like an ubiquitous patient monitor where you want to have on a handheld maybe the information, so maybe the real-time values, the curves, maybe also the alarms, and just display it to a clinical user so that he can look at the current patient status from outside the patient room. So this will be our example. And in order to set this up, we actually not only need the basic resources that we have seen so far, so device and device metric, but we also need the profiles that are defined inside of the PoCD implementation guide. And this looks a little bit more complex, and we have seen it in the example before already. So we do have the device resource here, and we do have three profiles for this resource. We have one for the medical device system on top, MDS device, one for the module level, VMD device, and one for the channel device. And for example, there's an addition to it that the status reason represents if these kind of devices are actually active. So if you could expect that they, for example, monitor the patient right now. We do have, as I mentioned before, also the device metric, which in itself has also not only two profiles, but some more for the different types of metrics. So for example, a numeric device metric profile and an enumeration device metric profile. but there will be also something for real-time sample arrays or for sample arrays to represent waveforms. And here you can also see something like an operational status or maybe a category. And the category, for example, would indicate if, let's say, we do have a ventilation pressure represented by this device metric, and this could either be a measured pressure or it could be the setting that is applied by the ventilator. So that's reflected in the category. And then we do have some more profiles on the observation that just limits, okay, what could be represented here, and for example, which then allows only a link, for example, to a device metric and of a special kind. What does this information, or how can we use this information now, or why do we have all these additional information in contrast to the personal health device? So, for example, if you think about this application that we talked about before, about the live monitoring of the patient, there might be something that currently, for example, the let's say plethysmogram or the pulse oximeter is not measured. So, and how do we now depict here that this value is actually not missing because we didn't receive an observation, because the background here is if we have observation, this would only show up if we did something already. But if we didn't do an observation so far, we don't know, we just wouldn't know that the device is actually capable of measuring, for example, the pulse. If we now look at the device metric, we would see that the device has the capability of, for example, measuring the pulse, but we would look into the operation status and see, okay, maybe it's off for whatever reason. Or it's in standby, or it is actually measured. And if we then don't see any value here, this might be an indication that there's a problem and that we maybe missed some observation measurements. One other question that you typically have to answer is if you develop these kind of applications, is the value that we actually display here up to date? And a big indicator for that is inside of the device metric as well. So we know that the device metric, for example, has a measurement period, and this measurement period reflects the repetition time for periodic measurements. For example, every second this should be measured. So if we don't receive an update here regularly, for example, every second or whatsoever, this would indicate that something has gone wrong, and maybe we need this to indicate to the user that he knows and is not confused. So that's why we introduced, for example, the device metric, and tomorrow in the Let's Build session, you will probably find more details about all the other attributes and why this structure of the MDS, VMD, and channel and device metric was also introduced into the FHIR resources, and why there's a different way for PhD devices and the point of care devices. Basically said, because the PhD devices are not as complex as the point of care devices. I now want to give you also an outlook, because inside of the devices world or device related resources that generate the data for our health data driven application, it's not complete yet. And one of the big topics is something that will be addressed is about physiological and technical alarms that maybe are from monitoring of the device, as well as notifications. And if you look at the data models that we use in the other standards, so for example, the IEEE 1173 SEC standards, as well as the PhD standard, you basically have to distinguish between something, the alert condition, so basically what is monitored, how it's signaled, so alert signals, and also the alert system status. So for example, if someone has turned off the monitoring for something, or maybe just the acoustical alarming. And this would be something that we currently would not be able to reflect correctly with the FHIR resources. So that's why I think a while ago the devices group basically started to design a special resources for that, to really indicate the alarm or alerting status of the device. And maybe one distinction here, just for information purposes, when we talk about alerts in the medical device informatics scene, then this typically captures alarms as well as notification. So something like measurement ongoing, in contrast to high blood pressure. So this is the content that I would like to present it to you, just also as an impulse, and maybe to generate some questions that we want to discuss. And before we go into the question and answer session, I would like to summarize for you what you should have learned, or where you should have gained some knowledge. I think the first one is that Devices on FHIR is actually designed to represent different types of health device data-driven applications, which could be from something like a device utilization dashboard over to maybe predictive maintenance to ubiquitous patient monitoring. So it's a quite broad range that we need to enable with our devices and profiles, resources and profiles. If you want to know more about it, and what you also will see on the Let's Build session, is that the core resources are basically device metric, and observation. And as mentioned before, there are two implementation guides that include mappings from other medical device interoperability standards. So in this case, the IEEE 11073 PhD group, standards group, and the IEEE 11073 point of care devices group, which comprises something that we call the classical domain information model, and something from the SDC standards family called biceps, which is just another domain information model. And also what you should have learned is it's actually not complete yet on the devices world. And there's more to come, for example, representing device alerts. And this will be worked on from the working group in the next months, because it's the one piece that is typically missing and that we want to address, is that we not only report the measurements and the settings, but also the alert state of a device, so that you can really build also a user face that reflects the user face interface on the device itself. If you want to look into the different mappings for the SDC standards family or the classic standards family, you can find them in the implementation guide. And for me, I have one last slide to share with you. And that is a reference to the Let's Build session, where Katrin and Tobias will walk you through certain questions on, for example, which devices are currently connected to a patient, how would I need to query a FHIR repository to get that information, and they will do the hands-on session to show you how all these resources and profiles are used to answer certain questions. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or have posted them already, Michael, please, I would be open for questions now.
Yeah, currently no questions, Stefan, but maybe you could let me know how both PhD and the 11073 groups are aligned.
Yes, so it's basically that we in the standards group, we now call everything just devices. and we work together in the same groups and align each other. I think that's the working mode that we have, that, for example, in the healthcare devices group or in the IHE devices group, it's basically always these two aspects. And in the 11073 working group, we also have parallel working groups that synchronize with each other.
Yeah, so a lot of the same people in each group, right?
A lot of the same people in each group, and this is how we try to align and also address all the different aspects of devices on fire or medical device interoperability in general, that we can also represent all these different use cases. And maybe one caveat here is, if you wonder why something is so complex using the device metrics or this recursive device structure, this is really related to the broad band of use cases that should be reflected with these resources.
Yeah, very good. So for anybody else on the line, you can unmute yourself and ask Stefan a question if you'd like. So feel free to do so.
This does not seem to be the case. Then I would say we have some minutes now so that you could switch over to the next session. I would like to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions after the talk, want to get in contact with us, you can contact me either via the Wova app or via my email address, or of course you can contact or add me in LinkedIn, and we can discuss all the topics related to devices on fire and maybe medical device interoperability in general. And as mentioned before, if you want to see how this works practically, then I can recommend the talk tomorrow from Katrin and Tobias. So, is there a question? Maxime, do you have a question? Maybe you can.
Are you able to unmute? No, he can't. He has no question. All right.
Okay, maybe I can do that.
Yeah, I can now.
Oh, perfect.
There are several questions in the Q&A.
That's strange. I don't see him.
Oh, by the way, that's very, that's great.
Oh, okay.
I see.
Michael, do you see any questions?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A. So.
Right. I don't mind reading them out. I just.
Oh, that would be great. Yes.
Yeah, please do.
A quick question regarding the observation time.
Yeah.
Especially with the devices in ambulances, we have seen the timestamp mismatches between the actual observation time versus time the mobile signal was made available.
Yeah.
We have seen that later timestamp is taken as the actual observation date time for all practical purposes. Any best way to deal with it? By Satya.
Yeah. I think that's a general problem if you don't have any time on the device itself. If you look at, for example, at devices that implement the IEEE SCC standard, they are required to have time capabilities, and, for example, also on how to synchronize the time. So there, the observation time would be really the device would generate in its measurements the determination time when the measurement has been done, and so this would be also what would be reflected in the resources, no matter how it's sent. But of course, if you and your device don't have any time source, this would be a problem, of course. But in general, if you, for example, implement this interoperability standard, then there's a very specific determination that you have to use the determination time and not the time when the message was sent. And this would be also in the implementation guide described that the determination time is mapped to the observation time. I hope that answered the question. Are there any further questions? There are, and you probably.
Yeah,
Yes.
I muted myself. Could unmute. Can you see the Q&A now? Should be.
Yes, we can. We have 4 minutes left, so it should be.
Okay. I see one short question at least by Winfried. Is there already a target FHIR release for alerts?
Hello, Winfried. I probably know which Winfried it is. I think there's no target date yet. It's something that's on the list for the working group, and we have been working on it quite for a while. But I think it's now the next big thing on the bucket list. And we are always happy to have people volunteer on doing the whole specification for it.
Maybe one last question.
Yes.
By Dimitar. Has there been any advancements on creating implementation guides for fitness devices such as Fitbit, data aggregators on Google Fit or HealthKit? I'm actually quite interested in that as well.
Yes. So these are typically devices that would fall into the PhD category. So personal health devices. And yes, there is an implementation guide for that. It includes a mapping from the 11073 standards, which I don't know if they implement this one, but at least it's a very good guidance on how to implement it and which resources to use. And in this case, it would be the more easy setup or configuration using just the device and observations. But still the mapping, so the implementation guide is actually pretty comprehensive. It's good to look at.
Okay, thanks. And for myself, question, are you by any chance aware of the project Radar CNS, which is leveraging these personal health devices in a platform?
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of the project, no.
Might catch up later with you on that.
Yeah, and if there are questions from the projects, for example, we could set up an exchange, and it's very helpful to always have these kind of different perspectives. As you have seen, the range of use cases is quite broad, but we can probably give recommendations very good on how to model it. So thank you very much. And I wish you all a good afternoon, good morning, and maybe good evening already. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the Dev Days.